Alrighty guys, welcome back. So today we'll talk about plants. We've got two PowerPoints, one on plant diversity and life cycles, and then the next one will focus just on angiosperms because they're such a large group. So all plants need gas exchange, CO2 for photosynthesis, and of course they'll release oxygen as a byproduct. They need sunlight, and they need water and minerals, which they'll get from their roots. So adaptations that allow them to do that. For instance, leaves are thin and flat on many plants that allows them to capture more sunlight. They have tiny pores that let gases in and out. Those pores are called stomata. That allows for gas exchange. And for water and minerals, they have xylem, which carries water, and phloem, that carries products from photosynthesis, like carbohydrates. So, and those typically xylem flows upward from the roots, and then phloem is going to sort of go all over the plant, but mostly downwards from the leaves, where those are the main site of photosynthesis, down into the stem and into the roots, where they can help store extra carbohydrates. So plants evolved from green algae. They were once considered protists, and other types of algae that are protists include the brown and the red algae. And the reason why the green algae is no longer considered a protist is because it has the same type of chlorophyll as land plants. So it has cellulose in its cell wall. It has the same types of chlorophyll that are in land plants. So even though they don't have true roots, stems, or leaves, some of them are unicellular, some are colonial. There are some multicellular green algae like the one I put on this slide, but you can see why they would be considered protists, and some of them are unicellular, but because they have the cellulose in their cell wall and the same type of chlorophyll as plants, we consider them in that plant kingdom. And keep in mind that the word algae can be confusing, because algae just means it's a photosynthetic organism that floats around in the water. So there's even algae that are bacteria. So cyanobacteria, the blue-green prokaryotes, are they're not protists, they're not plants. They're in a totally different domain. So, and then we've got the protists, which are photosynthetic algae. And then we have the green algae, which are considered plants. So the four main categories of land plants include the mosses and their relatives. They are seedless and they are non-vascular. What does that mean? So if they're seedless, then they release sperm and egg. And they don't have a protective coating or barrier around the developing embryo. And they're non-vascular, which means they don't have xylem or phloem, and that limits how tall they can grow. So you're going to see these guys reproducing near standing water or in areas that periodically flood, and they're not going to be very tall. Next we have our club mosses and ferns. I usually just refer to them as the fern group. They also rely on standing water because they're seedless. They're going to release sperm and egg, but they do have a vascular system. So they have xylem and phloem. They can grow taller. And then we have our seed plants. So they're vascular. They have xylem and phloem. They can grow pretty tall. They have seeds, so they can live in a variety of habitats. And the ones that have a naked seed, so it's not enclosed in an ovary, are going to be the gymnosperms, and then we have our flowering plants that have an enclosed seed. Here's a generalized plant life cycle. There's a sporophyte that produces spores and a gametophyte that produces gametes. So this is showing you the gametophyte and the sporophyte for a moss. So the gametophyte is the part that you're used to seeing, and the sporophyte you don't see quite as often, but the sporophyte will be releasing spores. The gametophyte underneath releases sperm and egg. I like this particular picture because it shows you the rhizoid. They don't actually have roots per se, but they do have a fibrous part underneath the ground that helps them to obtain water and minerals. So a little bit more about the life cycle. The sporophyte makes spores. The sporophyte itself is diploid, and it produces the spores through meiosis. And if the spores land somewhere and germinate, they can grow into a new haploid gametophyte. And the gametophyte will produce the sperm and the egg, and if standing water is present, the sperm can swim to the egg and grow into, well, it forms a zygote, which is diploid, and that can grow into a new sporophyte. So this is just showing you a generalized life cycle here. We've got the sporophyte that makes the spores. They can grow into new gametophytes, and of course there's male and female gametophytes that release sperm and egg, which can unite and grow into a new sporophyte. You don't have to memorize this. As long as you know there's a sporophyte that makes spores and a gametophyte that makes gametes, you're good. And you see a trend evolutionarily towards smaller and smaller gametophytes. So we've got our primarily the gametophyte for the moss. And then when you get to the ferns and you move up that phylogeny, you see that the sporophyte is the dominant phase. Same goes for gymnosperms and also angiosperms. The sporophyte is going to be the dominant. And you don't need to memorize this. I just like for you to be aware that green algae can do what's called alternation of generations, where they switch back and forth between haploid and diploid phases. And this is just showing you the life cycle for a unicellular green algae. So we'll talk about each group, what unites each group, some of their characteristics, and then how they reproduce. Mosses are non-vascular, so they have to live near the ground. They're not going to be very tall. They're also seedless, which means they rely on standing water for reproduction. And some of the relatives that you might be less familiar with include the liverworts and the hornworts. So the sporophyte is you're not going to see quite as often. The gametophyte is the dominant phase. That's the small, short, green carpet-like structures, and those release the sperm and the egg whenever standing water is present. And you don't have to memorize this. I just like for you to have some exposure to it in case you have any questions about their life cycle. I think it's nice for you to see that there's going to be male and female gametophytes that make sperm and egg, and of course if the sperm swims over to an egg, then you have the zygote form, and then that can grow from the top of the gametophyte. You can grow a new sporophyte. So here we have our fern groups. They're vascular, so they can grow taller, but they still rely on standing water because they are seedless. So the dominant phase now is the sporophyte, and you're going to have spores produced on the underside of the leaf. The gametophyte is really small. I personally have never seen one. I've looked for it, never seen it, but that's the part that produces the sperm or egg. And again, you don't have to memorize this. I just like, if you have any questions about their cycle and how it happens, hopefully this can answer some of your questions. But you can see that the plant that you're used to seeing is the sporophyte and the gametophyte. You really don't see much of. So seed plants have advantages because they produce pollen. Instead of releasing the sperm and egg in water, they release pollen, which can be carried by air, by the wind. It can be carried by passers-by. That sort of just sort of like Hitch's ride on an animal. So they no longer rely on standing water, and then they have a protective seed that's going to allow them to live in more extreme conditions, so they can live in a wider variety of areas. So we'll talk about the gymnosperms. First, there are male and female cones. So the female cones are the traditional pine cone you're used to seeing, and those are going to have the eggs for fertilization within them. And then we have male cones that produce pollen. Here's all the different types. The main ones, sorry you can't see it very well, but are going to be just conifers, pine trees. You can see, I know you guys are familiar with pine trees. So the tree itself is a sporophyte. Pollen grains are going to be the male gametophyte, and the ovule, which is contained at the base of each scale in the pine cone, is going to be the female gametophyte. And pollination occurs if the pollen grain lands on a scale, and it'll follow a little pollen tube down into the ovule, in which the sperm can fertilize the eggs within, and then that ovule becomes a seed to protect the developing embryo. So again, don't memorize this. Just like for you to see, the sporophyte's the dominant phase. We have the female and male cones. You can see the ovule here for the female, the pollen for the male. And if the pollen is carried by wind to the ovule, then you have pollination, fertilization, and then on that scale, the ovule becomes a seed. And if that pine cone falls to the ground, then that seed can germinate and grow a new tree. Just some other interesting things that I like to point out. Typically, the female cones are going to be towards the top of the tree, male cones towards the bottom. And that just helps to encourage wind to carry the pollen to other trees, as opposed to doing self-pollination, because they're being carried to other trees and pollinating nearby female cones of other trees, then you have higher genetic variability in the plants. And this is just showing you the female and the male cones. And this is a scale, so one of the scales that are part of the pine cone, you can see the base of the scale that is closest to the inside of the pine cone is going to have the ovule, which turns into a protective seed. So angiosperms are the most successful group, and partially is because they have a seed that's enclosed in a fruit, as opposed to just being part of the scale on a pine cone. They have a fruit, and some of that fruit is typical fruit like apples or peaches that might be eaten by an animal, and then they'll dispel the seed. It could be miles away even, which is great. Or it could be protective like the shell of a peanut, or fluffy like the fruit around dandelion seeds, and that just helps to carry the seeds elsewhere. Again, we're just trying to be more efficient at seed dispersal. They have flowers that contain the gametes, the sperm and the egg, or they really just contain the gametophytes, the ovules and the pollen. Like I said, these are the most successful of the plants. They're the ones that you're probably most familiar with. So the advantage, like I said, they have more efficient pollination. Gymnosperms are relying on wind to disperse their pollen. So they have to make a lot of it. That's what's covering the ground right now. It's covering cars and houses, and it's kind of a nuisance. So angiosperms don't have to produce quite as much pollen, and they have more efficient seed dispersal. Animals might eat the seeds and disperse them. Some of the seeds are carried easily by wind. Some of them hitch a ride with passers-by. So we'll talk more about that on our next PowerPoint, which is going to be exclusively just about the angiosperms. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.